this month's monthly seminar, which thank you very much for coming to this month's monthly seminar, which will be presented by Dr. Ali Hadawi. Dr. Hadawi is an organizational leadership and change management expert. Ali's extensive leadership and change management expertise in educational institutions spans over 20 years. His leadership interests are focused on organizational culture and the impact of institutions on local communities. He's been the principal of Central Bedfordshire College for 11 years, up until 2022, and prior he was the principal of Southend Adult Community College from 2006 to 2010. Among his other organizational responsibilities are being a board member of the Association for Research in Post-Compulsory Education, being a founding member of the vice chairman of Rawabit Steering Group, a UK-Iraq strategic partnership that has been engaging with the Iraqi vocational and the higher education sector since early 2004, and other exciting qualifications. However, we're going to hear about something a little bit different today. This lecture, what he's going to present, attempts to superimpose our current understanding of the role of Syeda Zaynab, peace be upon her, in Karbala in the modern day. It looks at the ways in which she developed her own skill set and her own spirituality to be able to carry out her role so impeccably well. Our current world is markedly different from the early years of Islam, yet we have our own challenges to overcome and develop. This lecture attempts to address one such challenge and offers a proposition for the future. So, on that mysterious note, we wait to hear what is that challenge and what is the view for the future. So we're going to have the lecture first and then a dedicated section for questions and answers afterwards. And the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Enlows. That's very, very kind of you. Colleagues, if I may start, I'll have a go at sharing my screen. Can I see a nod or a yes? Can you see something?
Yes, it's good.
Ah, perfect. Right. So this lecture is actually about relevance, in terms of the relevance of the role of Syeda Zaynab alayhi salam in the modern day. I'll need to move this, otherwise I won't be able to read what I'm saying. Right. Now, I mean, obviously, over the centuries, a lot has been written and said about the role of Syeda Zaynab. This is just one aspect of it, which is the way she articulated the message of Karbala such that it would continue and impact evidently for the past 400 years and 1400 years, and it would still be going. And in that, both Imam Hussein alayhi salam and Syeda Zaynab alayhi salam, I argue, would have planned a great deal for different possible eventualities, what activities they would take, what actions, how would they interact with people, what sort of slogans might they be using, what possible scenarios might present themselves to them at every stage, what timings for activities, for example. And of course, as an educator, I believe that everybody who achieves profound change has to plan for all of that. None of it just happens by chance. And parallel to that, and that's of course about skills, about understanding culture, which I'll come on to in a minute. but it's also about working on themselves. So there's self-purification, there is self-development in the spiritual sense of the word. So, and that would have taken, I argue, again, a considerable amount of time. And one of the pieces of evidence that leads me to suggest that is that we always hear that we actually don't know in history a great deal about Imam Hussein and Syeda Zaynab prior to Karbala. And then that leads me to think, well, they couldn't have just been sitting there twiddling their thumbs. And of course, there is a suggestion that they were, of course, interacting with people, doing what they do normally, which they must have, of course, just as normal human beings. However, there would have been a great deal of time dedicated to their own self-purification so that they could do what they did. Also, they wouldn't have just been thrusted into the situation, especially for Syeda Zaynab. So, sometimes in the literature, it would sound as though, Imam Hussein decides to leave Medina. So he goes and asks Syeda Zaynab, and of course, there was a promise that she would join him. So she takes her children and leaves her husband. And that I find that difficult to compute, if you like, in my head. I believe that Syeda Zaynab would have worked very, very closely with Imam Hussein on the preparation, and that would have in self-purification and also in terms of skills, in terms of culture, which I'll come on to, as I said. And the reason being is that these are big, life-changing events. And a great deal of thinking, planning, reflection would have needed to have taken place. So, in terms of her own personal development and her own emotional resilience, Syeda Zaynab would have been engaged in something that is highly individual to her, deeply spiritual, in terms of reflection, in terms of du'as, in terms of prayer, in terms of
I
practice.
said he would need at least half of his potassium, in which he should get by then.
Sorry for the interruption. If everyone could please mute, and I'm muting a few of you by compulsion as well. But sometimes it's hard to reach everyone. Sorry, please continue.
Thank you. Practical tawheed, that is to genuinely feel and believe and act in a way that only sees Allah in every action they do. Without that, she wouldn't have been able to attain what she attained. And alongside that, so that's about personal development. But alongside that is developing the skills and the attributes to affect society. And that is during her lifetime and in perpetuity, which of course we see and live now. So part of that is developing a deep understanding of people, of culture, of emotional well-being, the importance of language, the power of storytelling, for example, as means of transmitting knowledge, events, and preserving them. Looking at the psychology of victory, looking at the psychology of success, societal values, a lot of that would have been at play for her to consider, learn about, develop, hone all of those aspects so that they become natural to her. And also critically is connecting with people. Remember that society, just like now, 1400 years ago, would have had, people with different levels of understanding, different levels of spirituality, different levels of engagement with different aspects of life. And she would have needed to have worked out ways in which she connect with different cultures, different elements of her society, so that she is not then probably siloed in her conversation with one segment in society. So, are these reasonable assumptions to make? That is to say, she would have been working on her skill set, she would have been reflecting on her own spirituality, and she would have been engaged in self-purification and development. And the reason why I believe that must have been the case is that if we look at Karbala, Karbala represents an important juncture in Islam. It's like a corrective action that came at about 4 or 5 decades after the message had come with Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if you look at that corrective action in terms of the changes that took place in society, in early Muslim society, then what we can see is that from then on, there has been, and throughout history, there has been a clear path for those who want to stand up against tyranny, even if they are in sort of physical terms, they're weak in terms of numbers, in terms of power, in terms of wealth, and so on. And that was an important aspect for not only Islam, I would argue, but also for humanity. So that corrective action would lead us to suggest that there must have been a great deal of thinking, planning, to enable such profound change to have taken place. Also, what we see is a tangible, through that, what we see is a tangible manifestation of what Tawheed is in terms of the oneness of Allah Ta'ala. And that is important because the essence of the message of Islam, of course, I'm not a scholar, but the way I understand it, the essence of the message of Islam is about the oneness of Allah Ta'ala, is seeing Allah through everything. So that practical Tawheed, as opposed to we say it, but in our actions, actually we are fairly varied and fairly broad. Karbala represents that tangibility that people would have needed to see and experience or learn about when it comes to our age or our time now. It also represents, which just alluded to, and that is a symbol for power, how to lose a battle yet to succeed. You can get killed indeed. You can be taken as a prisoner of war, but yet you can still be a victor. Now, of course, when it comes to learning and training, as an educator, we all learn in a variety of ways. Learning impacts us differently, and we affect the people and the world around us in a variety of ways as well. And hence, the experiences that Syeda Zaynab would have gone through wouldn't necessarily be replicated if somebody else might go through them, but other people will be impacted. It will be profound, but might manifest itself differently. So when we look, for example, at the techniques that she deployed in terms of transmitting and preserving the message through storytelling, was that done by chance, or was that directed purposely so that the message could go across nations, across different languages, different communities, different continents, in time, of course, during centuries, across centuries in terms of time. And I would argue that that wouldn't have been a coincidence, that a great deal of thinking, a great deal of reflection would have taken place between Syeda Zaynab, Salamullah alayha, and Imam Hussein. And this is because things don't just happen by chance. If one intends to affect the world profoundly, then they need to work hard on themselves for a very long time to get to this level of impact through prayer, through reflection, through dua, as well as the skills. So what are the ways in which both Imam Hussein and Syeda Zaynab would have worked on the self-purification, for example, knowledge and skills, to lead this important change? And of course, there is massive, the reason why I'm linking here Imam Hussein with Syeda Zaynab, it's just there is a massive amount of interconnection between the actions of Imam Hussein and the continuation of the message with Syeda Zaynab. And that would have taken a great deal of work, again, to achieve that seamlessness. So she, for example, immersed people in the story of Karbala in a highly emotive manner through storytelling, orating. And then she used her ability, which is something she would have worked on, to then deploy her messaging with different levels of complexity, depending on the situation she's in. So if we look at early days Arabia, and we read in some history books, not all, that women would have been in their homes, they weren't interacting in society, they weren't seen, they weren't... I find that difficult to stack up, because if we look at, for example, the way Syeda Zaynab conducted herself, she must have had that, resilient character, ability to talk at the highest, office in the land at the time. That she couldn't have just been sort of thrown into this without prior preparation. It's not possible to conceive. So if we look at, for example, the different levels of sophistication that Syeda Zaynab had deployed, one example is when she was in Yazid's court. So in response to his question, how did you see what Allah did with your brother? She said, "Ma ra'aytu illa jamila." So I have seen nothing except beauty. And that is a profound saying for somebody who's just walked all the way from Iraq to Sham, to modern day Syria. Just had most of her family, including her sons and her brother, and her brothers, in fact, and their children killed. So she's reset the dial here. She's offered an alternative view of the values of victory, for example. And that couldn't have come from somebody who's not highly articulate, which is something she would have worked on, not living the oneness of Allah, so that she could see the beauty in this action. And also, she wasn't really threatened by, all of these men in the office or of the most tyrant ruler in probably on earth. She wasn't perturbed by that. And that, of course, that strength of character is something that she would have worked on and developed and honed, so that she's able to articulate at different levels to different people with different ways of being. So if we look at the way then she moved on to talk to Yazid, so she says, فَكِدْ كَيْدَكْ وَاسْعَ سَعْيَكْ وَنَاصِبْ جُهْدَكْ فَوَاللَّهِ لَا تَمْحُ ذِكْرَنَا. I'll translate for speed. So, and it's in front of you, of course. So plan your strategy. Of course, in Arabic, it's very melodical, and it really is beautiful. Plan your stratagem, strive to your maximum, and put your best efforts. But by Allah, neither will you be able to erase our memory, nor can you destroy our revelation, nor can you reach our heights, and your shame cannot be washed out. So what we see here is somebody who's very much in control of and in command of the situation. She's using a very powerful language to put Yazid and his entourage, if you like, in their place in terms of what she sees. She wasn't a broken woman one bit. If you read that, this is not the speech of somebody who's broken, who's just had most of her family killed. And that is why the argument is there was a great deal of planning and thinking and articulation, as well as the self-purification and the personal resilience. So let us now take a sort of a 1400-year shift forward and look at the way media, of course, storytelling and oration were the media of the day. So let's look at the modern day and why is that important to us. So back in 2021, Mark Zuckerberg rebranded Facebook, for those who noticed, as Meta, to signal a significant shift for Facebook to the metaverse, essentially introducing new ways for people across the globe excuse me, to communicate, to interact, to build relationships, to live virtual lives alongside the physical lives, including conducting business and so on. Microsoft are working on something similar as well. And this is important. And the reason why it's important, let's just look at some graphs and some data that tells us what is more likely to happen. So back in 2000, there were very early baby steps of modern day social media. I think I still remember, though I wasn't on it, there was something called MySpace, which was the biggest at the time. And by 2004, I'll show you a graph actually in a minute. I just want to share this data. By 2004, they hit 1 million active users. So hold to that number. That's only 2004. It's not far back, especially when you get to my age. And there were 1 million worldwide, 1 million daily active users. Currently, the average time spent on social media is about 2.5 hours a day. That is just incredible. It really is incredible. And of course, as is always the case with statistics, it hides just as much as it reveals, and you'll see why in a minute. In terms of, if we were to add that up with the numbers of users, currently that adds up to 11.5 billion hours spent daily on social media platforms. Currently, there are 62.6%, that's just over 5 billion users. There are 259 million new users taking up social media every year. That's 3 times the whole population of the United Kingdom every year. So let's look. So the blue, can you still see the graph? So there's a blue in front of you, and that is the world population who use social media. And I don't know what you call that, let's call it amber, 40% non-users. So that's interesting. Let's see now, out of those who have got access to the internet. So out of those who have got access to the internet, 93%, 93% use social media. So pretty much, you know, statistically, that's pretty much all the internet users. So as the internet grows, there will be more and more people using social media. This is showing us a graph of the different social media platforms from the year 2000 to the year 2018. I believe there is actually one that is more recent. It's just I couldn't find it in time, so I apologize. But essentially, I'm not really an expert on social media. All I'm trying to do is to show that this is something that is happening, is growing, and it's not going away. So we need to engage with it in a meaningful manner. That's all of these graphs, essentially, that's what they say. So if we now hear from Mark Zuckerberg or Microsoft or any of the big sort of internet computing providers, that they are working on the metaverse, then essentially my graphs, though they don't show anything about the metaverse, well, not my graphs, but the graphs I'm using here, what they're saying is, of course it'll happen, because that's what we were told back in, for example, 2000 or 2004. I was one of those who was very skeptical. I said, oh no, this will never catch on. And of course it did, and I'm proved to be wrong. So that is just the direction of travel. It will happen. It's not showing any signs of slowing down or changing course of direction, other than, of course, these new developments. So this is another graph that shows from 2005 to 2013. And again, you can see the growth. It's, you know, it's quite steep. There's no sign of it slowing down. And I think that's really, really important for us to take note of. This is telling us which is the biggest, and then the second biggest, and then the third, and so on. So the four biggest social media platforms that are currently being used are Facebook, or Meta, and that is just over 3 billion daily active users or monthly active users. YouTube, about 2.7 billion, WhatsApp, 2.4 billion, Instagram, and so on. You can see it. This is an important graph. Now, what this tells us, and the reason why I'm seeing it, I'm using it because it's showing us probably a direction of change in the way it's used. Now, this is in America. And again, I apologize because I couldn't find in time a similar graph that represents the rest of the world. But America is big enough statistically for us to learn from and understand how these dynamics is changing. So if you can see, back in 2019, TikTok was the smallest out of the three. So that's Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. I think between 21... Sorry. Yeah, 21, 22, it passed Instagram and expected about now to pass Facebook. And that tells us something. That tells us we need to understand what is it that TikTok does that the others don't. That's one thing. And also the next graph, and that is telling us about age groups and how they interact differently. So if you look at young people, so that's 18 to 29-year-olds, then the biggest platform they use is Snapchat. I apologize, I'm bombarding you with a lot of information about social media, but I'm trying to get to a point here. So if we look at, as I said, young people, then 18 to 29-year-olds use Snapchat, TikTok, and it's Instagram the most. 30 to 39-year-olds use LinkedIn, for example, Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram. It's interesting about LinkedIn because you see it with the 30 to 39-year-olds and 40 to 49-year-olds, which, because LinkedIn, as in the most, And because they essentially market themselves as a professional network, then you can see why people in these age categories tend to spend quite a bit of time on LinkedIn. And then 50 to 59-year-olds. There is a graph, I believe, which I'm using here. And this graph, I'll spend a few minutes to just explain what it's telling us. I must admit, actually, I haven't come across Be Real until I've done this preparation, but I've come across, not necessarily using them, but I know that they exist, the others. And you can see how the age groups change here. So, for example, the 18 to 29-year-olds, in terms of Snapchat, you can see where it is, and the 30 to 39-year-olds, that's actually fairly stable across all platforms. You can see actually in terms of the 50 to 64-year-olds and which platforms they tend to use the most and which platforms they tend to use less. And all of these aspects are important in developing an insight into the way potentially this metaverse is going to be more like what and less like what, and what is it that we need to understand about it. And this is about business. So the gray graph shows you social media marketing spending in money. And the red graph, or the red line on the graph, shows the impact of influencer spend. So that is, instead of marketing, for example, with, I don't know, for those of you who are familiar, I am a little bit familiar as a user. So instead of, for example, spending money on Google advertising, you might spend money on influencers. And that crossed over in just before 2022. So the return per pound or per dollar is higher, quite significantly higher, with influencers than with direct social media advertising. And this is an important aspect, because though you might not be, if you want to carry the message, for example, of Syeda Zaynab, well, you're not selling something, but you're still selling an idea. You're still trying to get people to be convinced by something or learn about something. And that is why these aspects of learning in terms of how to target certain age groups or where you should be locating your spend are critical. So when this new virtual reality happens, which it will, because as we have seen, there's no slowing down in terms of the growth of or penetration of social media, then when it actually happens, and it will make the world even more accessible across the globe, then the impact on communities and societies will be significant and will be profound. And it is important for those who believe, and I believe it should, that the message of Zaynab needs to continue. Then we need to understand this new world, and we need to be developing our skills, the way it works, in a variety of ways, in the same way as Syeda Zaynab planned and identified, for example, storytelling as a mechanism to transmit her message across centuries. So what I'm saying here is that it's no longer good enough for us to rely on storytelling in the old way. I think that will die with if you like, potentially with my generation. But if we want to tap into younger generations and the message for the message to continue, then we need to develop into these new world, new ways of being. So we need to develop people's experiences, especially young people, of course, skills into the metaverse as engineers, as programmers, as designers, as artists, as psychologists, as social scientists, as theologians, as authors, as influencers, of course, as augmented reality programmers, and all aspects. I mean, I really am not an expert. I just observe it as a phenomenon. The metaverse is expected to grow quite exponentially. So it's expected that by 2030, the size of the metaverse economy, so that is how much business being transacted, will be $400 billion by 2030. 2 years ago, it was 48. So can you just sort of picture this, the seismic growth that the metaverse is expected to achieve? And if you remember the graphs I showed around the growth of social media, then there is no reason to suggest that this will not happen. In fact, all the evidence points to, yes, of course it is going to happen. And it will be part of our daily lives in the same way as social media is now. And that is why we need to be developing young people's abilities to interact and live their lives in ways that can impact positively and be impacted positively as well. So I think I've said this, but it's about skills. It's about the relevance of the message of Syeda Zaynab, Karbala, and the martyrdom of Imam Hussein in the modern world, and how that needs to be adapted and transmitted in the new world in ways that are more relevant to enable communities to thrive and develop and in their own societies, and to interact, whether it's families, whether it's individuals, whether it's in the initiation of friendships. All of that will be directed and governed a great deal more than now through the metaverse. So if that is the case, then we need to be part of that change, and we need to be developing young people to be able to be active participants and contributors. I think I've covered that. And then I'm posing a question for discussion, really. I've taken about 40 minutes of your time. I'm obviously very grateful for your kind listening. And I'd like us now to have maybe a discussion about the ways, how would we do that? What are the ways in which we would do that, so that this adaptation doesn't lose us the essence of the message that has been preserved over the past 1400 years. And the reason why I'm posing the question is because I've actually heard from a lot of people, some of whom I really respect the way they think, is that we mustn't change the way the story of Karbala had arrived to us, because it lasted the test of time. It lasted over the past 1400 years. So we trust that it will continue that way. And I argue not, of course. So with your permission, I will now stop, if I can work out how to stop sharing, and open the platform for discussion. Of course, feel free to ask, and I'm happy to go back to whichever slide you want me to go back to.
I'm sure it's fine if anyone wants to put their questions either in the chat box or if they wish to raise their hands in a virtual manner, speaking of
Well,
virtual
I'm sorry,
reality.
I tried to find that icon for raising my hand. I couldn't find it. I know, but I couldn't find it on. So could I just put my question directly?
Yes, of
All
course,
right.
please.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Hadavi. I really enjoyed your interesting talk. I think I'm entirely agree with what you suggested to all of us and the cautionary tale which you try to share with us. There is one point which raised my eyebrow, which I would want to put it to you. Perhaps I misunderstood what you suggested, but okay, let me just turn my video on. Yeah, you told us that we should forget about the traditional ways of storytelling. I wonder whether you were just thinking about the telling of the story of Karbala and the heroes of the Karbala, or you were thinking in terms of more general ways of traditional approach to storytelling. Because if the latter is the case, I beg to differ. I think, although you were quite right in telling us that we need to be fully equipped in order to be able to deal with this newly emerged and fastly developing technology. But I think even with dealing with the technology, we need to keep our human touch. I am telling you out of my own personal experience, and I'm sure you have got the same personal experience. I'm sure you have got, like myself, small grandchildren, and you sit with them and tell a story to them. I have noted that when I share some ideas in the traditional ways of storytelling, they become enchanted, and that would stimulate the power of their imagination. And I think in this age, what we need is that power of imagination, because that is what would help them to further on develop their critical ability, combining the two, and be able to deal with the dangers which you warned us about. So thank you so much. Your comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pai. I'm glad you asked the question because I totally agree with you. And in fact, I would go further because storytelling now is recognized, and in fact, there's a lot of literature as well, as one of the most powerful leadership and management techniques. So it's not only within the family, not only within society, but also within an organization. So you'd use storytelling. So I absolutely wasn't saying that.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I didn't know that.
No, I'm glad you asked. In fact, I wish I have a really good question, a really good book on storytelling as a powerful tool for leaders and managers to use within their organizations, because you're absolutely right. What storytelling does, it connects the emotions with facts, whatever it is, culture, strategy, which then makes it much more digestible for us as human beings.
Very true.
So with that, my suggestion is not at all to move away from what worked traditionally. In fact, we absolutely need to hold on to that, but we need to be mindful that unless we understand the new world and move with it, we might then find that the train would have left the station and left us behind.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for that interesting explanation. I entirely agree with you. And let me finish by stating just this. Years ago, I was reading a paper, and the author had written that this following statement, that our fabric is made of storytelling.
Absolutely.
So I noted that is a profound thought.
Indeed.
Professor, thank you so much for a very stimulating and mind enlightening talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hadavi, for your lecture. I just like Professor Paya wanted to raise my hand, but I cannot find it on the screen. why do you think that it sounds odd that Syeda Zaynab left her husband? Thank you.
Not at all. No. I'm actually not at all. So the point I was making is it's a simplistic view that Imam Hussein decided to leave Medina, which I realize is actually not the subject of this lecture, but it's a simplistic view that Imam Hussein decided to leave Medina overnight, and he just told Syeda Zaynab to sort of gather her stuff and come with him. I don't believe that is the case. I think there's a great deal of thinking, a great deal of reflection, a great deal of planning. Remember that Imam Hussein was the Imam of the time for 10 years before he left Medina. I realize it was only Yazid had only just taken over, but Imam Hussein was the Imam for years. So a great deal of thinking in terms of who should stay, who should come, what would they be doing, what their role is. And that is, it's a valid view in terms of their impact, because Syeda Zaynab, I would argue, that was critical to the success of the mission. To move it from it being a battle that could be won or lost to much, much more profound than that, which we are living today. I don't know if that answers the question, actually.
Thank you very much.
Yes. I think I think there's a question in the. Why do you think the traditional methods? No. So I hope I answered. So question from Sister Shazia Sultana. I don't. No. I'm not suggesting that storytelling will stop. I hope I've covered that with Professor Paya. I believe storytelling is actually much more powerful now than ever. But we also need to recognize that we need to develop the ways in which we operate and transmit the storytelling. There's a hand, Professor. Sorry, I can't. Oh, Professor Clohessy.
Thank you. Yes, I am. I'm grateful. Always grateful to hear about Lady Zaynab. I think I have a great horror of social media. Maybe it's because of my age, but I think that we are far less articulate now than we were in previous ages when we had fewer platforms, certainly not as articulate as Lady Zaynab. And even worse than that, the more connected we become, the more cut off we are from the very people in the same room as us, often people in need. And the question, or the idea that I wanted to put before you, we've seen, especially in the last year, the amount of misinformation that is available now on social media. Often the truth is destroyed or blanketed in a tidal wave of falsehood. In terms of questions like passing on ethics to our children, and I think that's why storytelling is important, passing on ethics and passing on truth. Do you have any idea about the sort of boundaries and borders that we need to draw up? Let's say a suggestion, if you could, to the theologians among us, the sort of boundaries and borders we could draw up for the use of social media, because it's each of us inhabits a very tiny portion of social media, and that portion is already probably full of bias and prejudice and hatred. Never mind what's going on. How do we train our youngsters or train ourselves to use social media in a way that is ethical?
Whoa, Professor, this needs not a lecture, but a whole conference,
Yeah.
maybe. I think your earlier point, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. I think there is a great deal of misinformation. I agree as well that we are a lot less connected now than ever. But that is partly the purpose of this lecture, because it's saying not necessarily that social media is a good or a bad thing, but it's here to stay and it's growing at a rate of knots. So essentially, every year it adds three times the size of the United Kingdom in population, full population. That is just phenomenal. That is not going to go away. So that is something we need to recognize and live with. Positive or negative, that's, another matter for another day. In terms of, do I see ways around it? No, I'm afraid I don't. However, I think the presence of people who are, not only ethical in terms of what is being published, but actually conduct themselves ethically, should have an influence. Won't be massive, because I agree with you, we are just infinitesimally small, in these billions. I mean, if 62.5% of the whole world population is already on social media, I mean, it's just phenomenal. But I don't really have a way of sorting that out. But I agree that there needs to be some serious thinking. I totally agree. There are two other questions, I believe, on the chat. A question from Noor. In this new era, new generation, new technology, how should we relay the story of Karbala? Oh, well, right. Traditional. Yes. So essentially, this is the purpose of the lecture. So the lecture is saying we need to start thinking. So I don't have the answers. I've got the questions. But I believe that a lot of people need to engage with different backgrounds, different specialties, different skill sets, different cultures, different values, to be able to come up with something that could work, including, the arts, technology, social sciences. It really is, the world is a complex world, and we need to be able to develop in ways that could impact the world in the same way as Syeda Zaynab managed to impact the world. I mean, I think historians narrate that even Umar ibn Sa'd, who was the leader of the army which killed Imam Hussein, shed a tear when she spoke to him so sternly. I believe it's minutes or an hour or so after the death of Imam Hussein. So you can see the power of oration and the power of presence, provided you've got control of it, which of course Syeda Zaynab had it in the bucket load. And what I'm saying is we need to be working to develop that. Okay, thank you very much. How do you see? So I'm reading through the questions, sorry. But if you've got a question, just unmute and say so, and fire away.
So I have a question. Did you look into the discourse in and of itself of Syeda Zaynab? Because in social media, you have trends. So at one point, something is very important, and then it gets replaced by something else. And the first thing is forgotten and then another trend comes. So in the discourse, was there a movement, say, from more highlighting Al-Hussein's bravery to highlighting the loss to moving towards ta'ziyah and crying and so on? Were there sort of trends in Syeda Zaynab's discourse that we can, equate with the social media habits?
Very, very well put. Very well put. And you couldn't be more right. I'm afraid I'm not really qualified to speak about the subject. I don't. I think there are people actually in this gathering here who are much better qualified than me to talk about, how the message changed over potentially decades or centuries. I know sort of just by observation, of course, we know that as Muslims were persecuted, and especially scholars, and traveled outside the Arab world, we see the change into Farsi, for example, or Urdu, or Chinese. So that's over the early centuries, and more so lately in English, or German, or Swedish. So that would be one aspect. But in terms of the rest of the question, I think it's critically important, but I really don't have the skills or the knowledge to deal with it, so I apologize for that. So there's a question here. Right, so
you.
yes, there's a question about AI from, is it Sarah? Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So a key, of course, I think we'll see more and more of that. In fact, much sooner than we think, because I think it's either last week or the week before, Google has sought permission to build their own nuclear power stations to help power their servers for AI. So this is just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. There's a comment from Shazi Tahir, social media as a platform for information sharing and still. Absolutely, yes. So the question is, can social media does and use storytelling, and of course it does. In fact, storytelling now is even more powerful. As I said earlier, I've got a very recent book, in fact, as a leadership and management tool. So I'm not suggesting it doesn't, but what I'm suggesting is that we can't rely on old methods to survive in the next 1400 years. We need to adapt and modify and change and create to keep the relevance, because we believe it's relevant. It's just how do we do, what is our role in that relevance? So there's a hand up and there are more questions which I'll come on to. So Minu.
Hello and good evening, Dr. Hadavi. Thank you for your very interesting discussion about social media. I understood what the point that you wanted to make by basically comparing the activities of Syeda Zaynab and social media, but I'm not sure if I've understood what the point that you wanted to make by comparing different digital platforms. So if you can spend some words on why you compared those digital platforms with each other.
Thank you. Good question. So essentially what I was trying to say is, when we say social media, just as in the days of Syeda Zaynab, salamullah alayha, she would have looked at different ways of articulating the message. Because remember, in those days in Arabia, poetry was the most powerful. But she, of course, opted to use storytelling. I'm assuming she would judge that to survive, throughout history and cross cultures and cross communities in a more effective manner. I don't know. So the reason why I've put that graph is to essentially to say, well, when we say social media, well, different platforms offer different ways of experiencing and consuming media and knowledge and so on. And we need to be mindful of not only that, but also the way different age groups prefer and find more meaningful connections through one platform than another. That is to say, if I want to target the 16 to 24-year-olds, then I need to be talking to them through a platform or the way TikTok operates, as opposed to the way Facebook. But if you want to target somebody in my age group, then you're probably better off relying on a Facebook type approach, because there are more of us in this age category. So that was the point I was trying to make, and sorry if I've sort of got lost in there. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Nargis would like to share her experience with the youth. Please do. Hello.
Assalamu alaikum, Doctor. Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. I've been working with youth for many years. One of the things I've been experiencing is that youth today are deeply connected to digital platforms. So we can create engaging content such as videos, podcasts, animation, and even video games that tell the story of Karbala or Syeda Zaynab to convey its core message. Platforms like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, as you mentioned, and showed us in your graphs, are very powerful tools to reach a younger audience. And the other things I've been experiencing is modern educational approaches. Like we can incorporate the value of Karbala and message of Karbala, such as sacrifice, resistance, justice, and standing up against oppression into the modern educational tools, which can be done through workshops or storytelling or interactive apps or even online classes. And they learn very quickly with a relatable discussion. And the other thing is, in traditional majlis, we have to have some interaction, like playground for children, and let them to create with their imagination what we are telling them as a story or as just, coloring book or something like that. So the more we interact them, the more they would learn. And we cannot dismiss the role of family and community, because families and communities play a significant role in passing down values. Parents and educators can teach children about the value of the message of Karbala through relatable discussion, stories, and activities, and they would learn very quickly because they related to the modern days issues, such as resistance or standing up against the oppression.
I couldn't agree more. I do agree. Thank you. There's a really good comment in the chat box. It's not a question, from Nicole Correri, sorry. I wasn't suggesting that it's not happening at all. I think it is happening. I think it's powerful. I think some of it is very, very good. But my point is that there needs to be a lot of support and recognition for it. So, for example, the film that you have done, I don't know how much support you received for that. Is it recognized as something that it's really needed and you need a lot of support, as in a lot of support is offered as opposed to needed? So my observation is, of course, there are a lot of influences as well out there. So I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that it doesn't exist, but I am suggesting that it's not big enough and it's not nearly anywhere near the level of support that it should receive and recognition. I don't know what your view is on it. Feel free to unmute or add a comment.
Salam, thank you for your response. Yeah, this is certainly, and in conjunction with your last speaker, this is something that I was involved with for many, many years, decades ago. But there's so many factors that relate to how any kind of project can get off the ground to make an impact for the youth, which is really the impulse behind, I believe, what you're talking about, and our previous speaker, Nargis, was mentioning, and certainly the kinds of things I saw many, many years ago. Certainly, that impulse has been around for over 2 decades, if not more. And I am looking at it in my dissertation, actually, and it is the rise of the online digital majlis, and how that has evolved and why that even developed. But when you talk about, for example, let's say, was there support for the video that I did or the support for the other one? These are networks of influence, right? And they're gendered as well. It was a great video that we were able to achieve because we were on sites, sacred sites. So what that particular first effort did was allowed people to see some of these places firsthand and hear the story in more detail from whatever sources we have, which of course again, as an impulse from the youth and the young adults in our communities who want to know more about who Zaynab, for example, really is. What did she do? What is her story? And I'm very indebted to Professor Clohessy for his recent book, which will be in my dissertation. But all of that to say that I think the impulse behind what you're suggesting, what Nargis is talking about, what I've experienced is this desire to know more and to understand more in depth things that we've only heard in narratives or poetic form in the traditions of origin of our various Shia communities, right? So there's this taking it from something that was not accessible to people and trying to make it more accessible using the tools and platforms that are au courant at the moment, right? So those are my thoughts. And thanks again.
Thank you. I do agree. Thank you for that. But of course, there is a responsibility. You know, I believe we have a responsibility to preserve the message for as long as we are around, just as, you know, previous generations have. Oh, thank you for this. I'll have a look. So Sister Fatima posted. I'll have a look. But colleagues, just to reaffirm the point, I'm not suggesting that it doesn't exist. In fact, it exists. Some of it, as I said, is very good. My point is that it needs to be a lot more and a lot more powerful. So both in quantity and in quality, we need to be doing a lot more to be able to reach, as in further the reach and preserve the message, if you like. But I'm not suggesting it doesn't happen. It does happen a great deal, and it's good, some of it.
I have a practical question that I'm sure is floating around on a lot of our minds. We may have some hopes in how to use social media, but we are seeing with respect to current events that there's heavy censorship on these platforms of certain viewpoints. And these are, you know, there appear to be algorithms which enforce them and diminish certain voices without, you know, it's not democratic anymore. So how does one deal with the fact that social media, in the era of the monetization of the internet, which is today, and the corporatization of it, you know, it's controlled by financial elites who have certain interests versus wanting to use it for a certain cause?
You see, that is a really difficult challenge, I think. But that's not just a challenge for us. It's actually also a challenge for society as a whole, for world communities, for world peace, for democracy. I think the point that Professor Clohessy was making earlier, absolutely, you know, is relevant and will continue to be relevant. Because, you know, the relationship between the powerful and the powerless, you know, that has been throughout history. It's just, it's quite pronounced now, if you like, and we're experiencing it in our daily lives. But I think more presence is a good thing, because it will impact. I think we've exhausted the questions, so if I may just thank everyone here for your time, for your interaction, for listening, for the questions. Apologize for shortcomings, and I wish you a very pleasant evening.
You too. Thank you very much for the lecture. It seems like it was greatly appreciated, judging by the comments in the chat, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.